Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. Thank you for joining us for our April J Talks Live event held just ahead of Earth Day, covering the conflagration, journalism on the wildfire frontiers. As we gather to reflect what it means to bear witness to the effects of climate change, I also want to acknowledge the original stewards of the lands on which we meet. I'm joining you today from Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We are grateful to live and work on these lands. Today's program is generously sponsored by Intact, the founding and ongoing supporter of the CJF's Climate Solutions Reporting Award, and we are deeply grateful for their continued commitment to this work. Thanks as well to Cision, our in-kind supporter. Our discussion will run for an hour today with time for audience questions near the end. To submit your question, please use the tab on the right of your screen anytime. And if you're in Toronto and would like to continue these conversations live and in person, join us tomorrow evening at Massey College for A View from Washington with David Patterson and Rob Benzie. They'll discuss the political currents shaping Washington, what they mean for Canada-US relations, and why they matter here at home. The conversation will be followed by a cocktail reception. We have a small number of tickets still available, and we'd love to see you there. And to stay up to date on CJF programs and events, you can sign up for our newsletter. For many of us in Canada, in these early days of spring, last summer's wildfires can feel like a distant memory. But recent years have made one thing unmistakably clear. Summer is no longer just a season of black flies and sunshine, it's also wildfire season. Last year, Canada experienced its second worst wildfire season on record. More than 6,000 fires burned over 8.3 million hectares, and more than 85,000 people were forced to evacuate, including over 45,000 people from 73 First Nations communities. Those numbers are staggering, but they tell only part of the story. Even after the flames are out, the consequences continue in long-term health impacts, economic disruption, displacement and trauma, and in the growing reality of climate-driven fire seasons that are reshaping life across the country. They are also reshaping journalism, changing how reporters prepare, what they're being asked to witness, and how they tell one of the defining stories of our time. Today's panel will explore what it means to report on a disaster that is no longer exceptional but recurring, no longer unthinkable but expected. Our panelists today bring perspectives from across Canada and the United States, and I'm honored to introduce them. Based in Vancouver, Michelle Cyca is the Narwhal's Bureau Chief for Conservation and Fellowships and a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory. Colleen Hagerty joins us from Los Angeles, where she specializes in disaster reporting. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, BBC News, The Guardian, and The Washington Post, as well as in her weekly newsletter, My World's on Fire. And joining us from Vancouver is Nancy MacDonald, national reporter for the Globe and Mail. From Duncan, British Columbia, we welcome photojournalist Jesse Winter, recipient of the 2024 CJF Edward Burtynsky Award for Climate Photojournalism and author of Wildfire, Dispatches from a Country Ablaze, due out May 6th. And guiding today's conversation from Vancouver is a multi-award-winning journalist with a storied and distinguished career. She is one of Canada's most trusted voices in environmental journalism. It's Laura Lynch, host and creator of CBC's What on Earth. We are so grateful to Laura and to all of our panelists for bringing their experience and insights to this conversation. Laura, over to you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And I'm hoping everything's going to work today because I've been having a few technical difficulties here, but I trust that everything will be fine for our really important conversation. And thanks to all the panelists for joining us, because I admire your work. It just goes without saying. I just want to start off by, because I'm pretty sure I'm the oldest one here, saying that term wildfire season, it actually didn't really exist when I was in my 20s. and there were fires burning in certain parts of the province, and they merited coverage then because they were unusual. And that has changed now, and even this idea of a season doesn't really fit anymore. So I just wanted to get your responses to that. Nancy, is that what you found, that it's not a season anymore, really?
Yeah, it's we're no longer dealing with bad fire seasons. We're living inside a shift where fire is becoming a permanent feature of the landscape. And the problem is our institutions are still organized as if it's episodic. And climate change isn't just making it worse, it's changing the rules. We've got longer seasons, lightning in new places, fires across multiple regions. The old playbook where we shift crews around and wait for the heat to break starts to fail when everything is burning at once.
And then that whole idea of zombie fires too.
Yeah.
Well, Jesse, what about you? I mean, you've been covering them pretty intently. Is it a year-round thing as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, I think it really is. And you've started to see those patterns south of the border, further south of us. Like there were fires in January in the US. There are fires basically year round, and we're getting closer and closer to seeing that in Canada. There was a fire in the Rocky Mountain foothills this year in January. So fire season officially ended at the end of October and began again in January. And so, as you said, talking about it in terms of framing it as a season no longer fits the paradigm that we're in.
And Colleen, what about south of the border? Is it the same there?
Yes, we are definitely seeing significant wildfires happening year round now. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, where we had the fires last year that were in January. So that's not within the traditional season that you would expect to see conflagrations of that size in Los Angeles, but that's just the new reality that we're seeing here as well.
And Michelle, what about your perspective?
I don't have too much to add on that, except that I think when we think about wildfire season, people are often thinking about when the fires are burning. And often, for many of us, we're aware of wildfire season when there is like smoke in the air that we can breathe in, and then we become aware of it. But the effects of wildfires, I think, are lingering all year, both for communities that are impacted by evacuations or by being directly impacted by wildfire. And also responses to wildfire, proactive responses like prescribed burns happen outside the burning season in spring and fall as well. And so just trying to think about it as a year-round topic is definitely something we're trying to shift towards.
And I'm wondering then, Michelle, how does, I mean, it might be different for your publication, but how does it affect your newsrooms? This is for all of you, but we'll start with Michelle. Your newsroom's interest in the story and the resources that the bosses are willing to invest in to cover it, to give it that year-round coverage.
Yeah, so
you go first, Michelle. Have a go at that.
Sure. I mean, at the Narwhal, because our focus is entirely on the natural world, and wildfire is a naturally occurring phenomenon as well as one that's been exacerbated by climate change and by human activity. We do try and cover it year round, partly because we are trying to take our cues from people who are working in wildfire, who do think about it year round, who think about trying to mitigate the severity of wildfires, who engage in things like cultural burns and prescribed burns to try and manage the landscape. And, thinking about wildfire reporting, not just as something reactive, but proactive to try and help people understand why fires are getting worse, what lies ahead in 2026, which is shaping up to be a really hot, dry year and probably a really severe wildfire season, I think is necessary because it's very clear from the scale of many of the fires in recent years that responding to wildfire isn't sufficient. The fires are too big, they're too severe. And so we have to be thinking about how we can start to prevent wildfire or mitigate its severity, which I think requires thinking outside the wildfire season. And those are places where a smaller newsroom, where we can't be on the ground in every major wildfire, we're not as nimble as a larger newsroom, but we can think year round about how we cover wildfire reporting and just try and reframe how people think about it.
I want to come back to you a little bit later on about what you see that you don't feel without, I mean, and it's not an insult to anybody, but what may not be covered by the more legacy, if they use that word, media organizations. But Jesse, you have recently moved over to the Globe and Mail. What are you finding about your newsroom's interest in the story and the money that your superiors are willing to spend to get that done?
It's interesting, yeah. So I did just join the Globe full-time in January, but I've been freelancing for them pretty consistently for the last few years. So I sort of straddle this world between seeing what it's like as a freelancer. Colleen, I'm very curious to hear about your experience as freelancing south of the border. But to answer your question, I think there is definitely growing interest to cover this year-round. I think the challenge is that our audiences aren't ready for that yet. And so even if newsrooms are starting to think about this in the right way, we still have this challenge of like, well, nobody wants to read about a wildfire story in January when it's raining or snowing. And unfortunately, that's the perfect time to be reading about or watching or listening to the kinds of stories that Michelle was just talking about, the kind of preventative things that can make a meaningful difference in terms of how we learn to live with this thing that's now a year round. And so I think part of what we have to do as newsrooms is get good at training our audiences to expect this coverage year round and to understand why we're telling them a story about cultural burning in February or about home hardening in November, that sort of thing.
How do you do that, Jesse? How do you train them? I like that idea, but I'm not sure how you do it.
I don't know. I think a big part of it is connecting it back to quote unquote real people and real people's lives. I think part of the problem with wildfires now is that when they're bad, they're so bad that it almost beggars belief. And it's a scary thing for people to think about. And so when there's nothing on fire, it's really easy for audiences to say, I'm just going to put this out of my mind. I can't deal with this. There's too much else going on in the world. And so if we can find ways to unwind the fear response that comes up with wildfires, like I have family members who still have cedar hedges right next to their houses, and I've been telling them for years, you need to get rid of those cedar hedges. This is a kind of mitigation effect that people can take. It's an easy step, but engaging in that conversation, I think, is scary for people. And so if we can find ways to help them see past the fear of it, then maybe we can start to help them engage a little more directly.
And I got to pick up on that, and I'll come to you after this, Nancy, with Colleen, because I was looking through your work last night and I noticed that you had done a wire cutter sort of advice list for the New York Times. The wire cutter is sort of the what to buy consumer type information, and I was so taken aback to see an entire wire cutter column about how to deal with fire, what to take with you. And how to prevent. How did that come about, Colleen?
Sure. So in addition to the work I do freelancing, I write about emergency preparedness for Wirecutter. And especially coming out of the wildfires we've seen over the past 5-10 years, really, in the US, there is a growing conversation, certainly, about personal preparedness, but also community preparedness, which is something I really try to include in there, because this isn't something that, one person can really solve for themselves. This is a community-wide problem. This is a large scale issue. This is policy, land use. So I'll write about, ways that you can get those hedges off, really take those smart steps for yourself that research has shown are helpful, but also trying to put it in the scope of what is this larger issue, and how can we make sure we're actually paying attention to all of the parts that are contributing to it.
It's so interesting to see it, though, built out as consumer advice in the same column where you have makeup and outfits and luggage and all that sort of thing. Whose idea was that? And do you have any sense of how receptive the readers were to that?
Wirecutter has been doing emergency preparedness reporting for a good number of years now. It really started with, I have colleagues who have had to evacuate from storms from wildfires and seeing that experience in people's own lives and saying, well, I wish I had taken these steps. I wish I'd put together that go bag and really thought through what an evacuation would look like. Audience wise, we've definitely, one of our most popular posts on social media last year was about masking and dealing with wildfire smoke. We are absolutely seeing that interest from people. I think, to Jesse's point, there's definitely, we are seeing it related to an event. So that challenge is, how do we get people thinking about this at different points in the year? But what we try to do is make those living documents. So as we are seeing new questions from people, as there's new research coming out, we're constantly updating those articles. So that way it is information that when people need it, it's ready for them to read.
And so then back to sort of the main question I'm asking everybody, how are you as a freelancer finding interest in the story and the people who are willing to pay for you to go out and cover it?
I have been pitching and getting picked up wildfire stories year round for a good number of years now. It has definitely gotten easier, I'd say, in recent years. There's more of an appetite from it from newsrooms in the US. I think part of the way that I've approached it is I really do see wildfires as cutting across all areas of coverage. These are personal stories. These are, breaking news and human impact stories, but there's technology components. There's certainly political components. So I tried to approach it from these different angles to better fit different publications. I had an article in Teen Vogue a couple years ago, and that was about the experience of students who had lived through a wildfire and what that meant for their high school careers. So I really tried to find the spaces where people are open to having those conversations in different ways. And I have found that's something that people are reading year round.
And Nancy, what about you? What's your what do you think is going on in terms of your position in the globe and the appetite for the stories?
I mean, I think one thing we've got to get better at doing is covering the recovery. I think it's the missing half of the story. We cover the evacuations and the flames really well, but not the years after. Toxic ash, lack of insurance, the mental health strains, the uneven rebuilds. I mean, some communities never really come back. And so the disaster isn't just the fire itself, it's that long tail that follows after. And I think that's something that my outlet and others need to get better at covering. You've
done some of that though, haven't you, Nancy? You paid attention.
Yeah, we pay attention, but it's easy to get an editor's attention when there's a fire, and just less so when you're talking about the after effects. I think it's what it's partly what the audience wants to read. If there's a fire in Jasper, they want to know what's happening, or Fort Mac, they need to know that information. Getting excitement for big reads about the rebuild in Lytton is tougher, but we got to do it.
And Michelle, then I do want to come back to you then. So what do you think then is getting too little coverage? You of course are doing a lot of coverage, but when you look out at the other media, what do you think is getting too little coverage?
I mean, I think as everyone has said on this call, it can be challenging, I think, to place these stories outside of the peak wildfire season when there's a lot of reader interest and a lot of interest from assigning editors. So I think there's probably lots of things that, in an ideal world we could cover more and also get more people to pay attention to. I think one challenge perpetually in reporting on all issues, but in wildfires among them, is that disproportionately First Nations are affected by wildfire because so many of them are in rural and remote and northern regions around the boreal forest, where we're seeing a lot of wildfires, a lot of increasingly severe wildfires. And those are just communities that are quite challenging to report on often. You don't have reporters nearby. It can often be hard, especially when there is a disaster or a wildfire that's actively happening, to get a hold of people in a small community. in 2025 and 2023, I covered wildfires affecting Île-à-la-Crosse in Saskatchewan, in northern Saskatchewan, which is near a proposed protected area called Sakatawak. And about half of that proposed protected area burned in 2023, and the other half burned in 2025, both in very severe wildfire seasons. And it was an important story to tell, but in a small Indigenous community, you know, there's often challenges just getting a hold of the right people. So I can appreciate why it's a challenge often to cover these stories. But to me, that's a reason, again, to try and think kind of year long about our coverage and be proactive in reaching out to Indigenous communities, other communities affected by wildfires, when they're not in a time of crisis, to try and report on both the impacts, the long tail effect, and also what they're trying to do proactively. So we did a story last year about the Kainai Nation in Alberta, which is developing a fire guardians program, so training a workforce of people who will proactively steward the landscape and try and mitigate wildfire risks, try and restore cultural burns. And we recently published a story about the Salish firekeepers in interior BC, which similarly, I think, are trying to train people across First Nations to restore cultural burning practices. And those are stories that we were able to tell when the communities had capacity as well. And that also, I think, again, help frame fire as something that is part of the ecosystem that has a role to play, and that can be, I think, something we think about outside of these terms of crisis or these times of crisis when it's really acute. But that's a challenge to do. I think it requires developing relationships, and it does require newsrooms being willing to think about fire as a topic that isn't just a crisis topic, but an environmental topic that needs to be covered consistently.
Okay, I'm sorry, Michelle, I missed a little bit of it because I was locked out for a moment, but I am back. Does anybody else have anything to say on the topic of what's not getting covered properly or enough?
Yeah, I can jump in there quickly. I think one of the things that I've noticed that's changed, and this is what I hear a lot from firefighters about what has changed in the last 10, 15 years, is the varying scale of possible fire behavior. We have a tendency to talk about all fires as bad. And when there's a fire near a community, we frame it in terrifying terms all the time. And I think part of learning to live with fire in a better way is to understand that not all fire is bad. A big part of why we're having such devastating fires right now is because we got so good at suppressing them for so long. And so you have forests that are loaded with fuel, and you layer on top of that the impact of climate change. What that's creating is scenarios where some fires in some conditions are actually beneficial, or at the very least are suppressible. They're the kinds of fires that we can respond to. Unfortunately, the flip side is that you also then get fires that are absolutely unsuppressible, but the public still has this belief that we can and should suppress them. And so when you see major disasters like Jasper, and people are asking questions about, well, what did the fire service do wrong? Why weren't there water bombers? Why didn't they put the fire out? There was no putting that fire out. When the Jasper wildfire was burning at its peak, it was generating the same amount of energy release as 7 nuclear weapons. That is not something that we can stop, at least not in the moment when it's actually burning. And I think until we can help people understand the nuance of that, and that there are times to be truly afraid of wildfire, and there are other times to not be terrified of it. And if we can help unpack that nuance for people, I think we can get to a place where we're less reactive and we're more willing to be proactive. But it's a challenge for sure.
Part of that also, though, I mean, yes, it's our responsibility to get that information out there, but it's also the responsibility of the forest services, the spokesmen, the politicians. I'm going to throw this out to any of you. How good a job are they doing at getting correct? Oh boy, I see Michelle reacting, getting that information out there in a way that actually delivers what is something that's relatively good for the environment. Michelle, you look like you want to tackle that.
Oh, I was thinking back to last summer when Danielle Smith suggested that climate change might be a factor, but also arson would be a factor, which is, again, a piece of misinformation that lately runs rampant every summer and actually hasn't really been something we've touched on yet. But I do feel like misinformation is a growing problem in reporting on wildfire. There has been a persistent rumor that fires are started, by eco-terrorists or by radicals. And certainly a lot of fires are human caused, if not intentionally set. That's a very small number of fires, but we have had a premier in this country amplifying that misinformation, partly as a way, I think, to downplay the linkages between climate change and in Canada's massive oil and gas industry. And one really serious problem in Canada, and a problem that I think politicians have maybe not figured out how to address head on, is that we still are a resource-based economy. Our oil and gas industry is growing. There's an interest in expanding it. And that is directly contributing to climate change. And it's hard to take the threat of wildfire seriously if we're not willing to consider how our economic activities are exacerbating that risk factor. And that's a fine line that I think a lot of politicians have not figured out how to walk, or a contradiction maybe that they are not willing to confront.
Yeah, I know out here last year, we actually saw the Forest Service people who were sending out the messages trying to contend and head on. What did you think of their efforts in that respect?
Sorry, I lost a little bit of your audio. Their efforts to respond to misinformation.
Yeah, I was giving it to Nancy, but I'm not sure you heard me, Nancy. Did you hear me?
No, sorry. No, sorry, I didn't.
Okay, what I was saying was last summer we saw the BC Forest information officers making an effort to contend with that disinformation head on a number of times. And I'm just wondering what you thought of the efforts that they made.
Definitely appreciate the efforts, but I think one of the biggest problems we face in Canada is the fact that we can't access the front lines of wildfires and tell the stories ourselves. And I think it's distorting what Canadians are allowed to see and understand about one of the country's defining risks. These zones are tightly controlled. Journalists are kept at a distance. And so as a result, we get BC Wildfires version of events or Alberta Wildfires version of events. And when you can't get close, you miss all kinds of granular realities, how these decisions are being made, how crews are being stretched, what kind of trade-offs are happening. And when you have these complex, fast-moving fires, those kind of details really matter. Wind shifts, resource shortages, communication breakdowns. Those are the things that don't come out in the official briefings. And I think there's a public trust issue too. When access is restricted, coverage starts to look like stenography, and over time that can erode confidence. So I think there's sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's a really good point. And Colleen, I want to come to you. Can you? Okay, I'm going to try again. Jesse, you've done more than just about anyone I know to try to insert yourself into the front lines. It has always been this way, in my experience of covering fire decades ago, that they never let us near the front lines. So can you talk about what you've done to get as close as possible and what that has revealed to you?
Yeah, it is extremely frustrating. And I think what I've noticed is that it's getting more frustrating because I recognize the degree to which the fire agencies are trying to correct misinformation. They're not obfuscating, I don't think, from a sense of trying to hide information. I think they get trapped in their own strategic communications bubble where they're just afraid to say, it's the standard comms line is say as little as possible. And what that does is it obscures the nuance that Nancy was talking about. And it creates a void that is then filled by misinformation. So to try and combat that, I've been pushing to try to get access to frontline fires in BC. And I've had some success. That's everything from getting basic wildland firefighting training. So I have the same level of training as a contract wildfire crew. I don't have the same level as a provincial crew, but what will be considered a type 2 crew in British Columbia. So I have that. I have all the PPE. I've spent years talking to firefighters, trying to learn and understand how fire works. take opportunities to see it myself, because these are dangerous spaces. Like, let's not kid ourselves. There is risk involved in going to these places, and sometimes that risk is risk to yourself. Other times it's risk to the people around you. If you're someone who's not prepared to operate safely in a wildfire zone, you can put the fire crews at risk, because if you get yourself in trouble, they're going to respond. They're going to try and help you, and that can compromise their organizational structure. And I think one of the things that we've seen in Canada is a increasing reliance on freelancers generally in journalism, which I think is concerning, and that is pushing a lot of pressure onto freelancers to try to get access to fire zones in ways that are dangerous and are not safe. And that causes the fire agencies to double down and be even less likely to consider letting us in. And the result is that you have a fire where crews are doing their best, incident commanders are making really challenging coin flip calls in harrowing circumstances that sometimes go right and sometimes go wrong, but they're doing the best that they can. And we're unable to tell that story to the public. The government's unable to tell it themselves because they're afraid to say more than the absolute minimum. And the result is a public that goes, oh, you screwed this up, you burned our town down, and public trust in fire agencies starts to collapse. And that's, I think, a really, really problematic part of where we're at. I'm very curious, though, to hear from Colleen about what access is like in the US, because from my perspective, it's kind of a panacea, but I'm sure that's not actually the case.
Go ahead, Colleen.
Yeah, I do want to pause for a minute on what Jesse was saying there, just in terms of the training that he has undertaken to be able to cover this responsibly. I mean, that's a massive undertaking to go through that work, to have these connections and really do that ahead of time. And I think it's really admirable and smart. And I also think as freelancers, like, that's really hard because a lot of us are really hustling to get by. And I know I've done similar training myself, and I've been fortunate to be able to get some grant funding to cover things like PPE, which is really expensive. So I think when we are seeing more freelancers being employed to cover these disasters, there's a lot of questions that come to me in terms of like what those safety agreements look like. I will say I've often had to initiate it on my end with editors where I say, like, I'm going to do this. I would like to have a check-in call, or I'm willing to go to this area, but if this happens, this is when I leave. It's not always a conversation that's initiated in newsrooms. And I just like to mention that because I don't think there's a lot of protocols around these conversations. And it really is not just dangerous for the freelancer, but as Jesse was saying, I mean, it can create a more dangerous situation for multiple people if you have someone going to these areas and there aren't those parameters or that experience or expertise involved. Yeah, covering in the US is very different area by area because you just have so many different agencies with different rules. In California, we are able to have pretty good access, definitely the best that I've encountered in the US. But still, during the Los Angeles wildfires last year, we were dealing with county, state, federal firefighters. Like, they all had different expectations of where a journalist could or should be. So even when I was working for newsrooms and had like letters and press credentials and PPE, I still hit some roadblocks where they weren't letting me through. Just because there wasn't even that understanding from some of the officials on the front lines of whether journalists should have access. So yeah, it's a bit of a different story depending on where you are in the US.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm having so much trouble on my end. I got the gist of what you were saying. Is there anyone else who wants to reflect on that aspect of the idea of getting proper access and being able to tell all sides and shades of the story, oversee this kind of thing?
I guess one other element that I would add to this part of the conversation is that I spoke a lot about how difficult the government agencies make it for us to tell their story and to actually be clear about exactly what's going on in these spaces. Of course, the other group of people that are completely shut out of the conversation by these kinds of roadblocks are the impact of communities themselves. people who are either still inside an evacuation zone or who are dealing with an evacuation. One of the most, and I think this problem is actually getting worse, not better. After the Jasper wildfire, Parks Canada and the municipality kept media restrictions in place after they decided it was safe to let residents go back. So the media was actually subjected to a greater level of restriction than even the public. And this was done under the argument that there needed to be privacy for the residents of Jasper. And this is going to be a controversial opinion that I'm sure not everyone will agree with, but I don't think there is such a thing as privacy when an entire town is leveled or a third of a town is leveled. That is the most public of possible disasters. And the idea of putting a big cone over the whole area and preventing the residents themselves from having the agency to decide whether they want to engage with the media or not is frankly crazy. And it really alarmed me to see that happen. And I think it was also a little surprised that we didn't see more pushback or upset from the public about that, because I think we haven't done a good job of telling our story about why we need this access. And the people who lost it, yes, obviously, like, we all want sensational photos. We all want all of that thing. But me in particular, I'm a photojournalist, so I want that access. But the people who lost out in that case and in other cases where those access is prevented are the members of the public, the people who live there, who don't even have the opportunity to interact with us and decide for themselves whether they want to tell their stories.
But that's important, Jesse, because you said that you want them to have the agency to make their own decision, but you do have to respect their privacy. So how do you, if you get access like that, how would you approach it?
For me, I think I would approach it, especially if you're in a space where the public has been let back in and there are homeowners, going and seeing their properties for the first time. I'm not going to photograph anybody outside their destroyed home unless I talk to them first and ask if they're okay with it. Am I going to photograph the community itself, though? Yeah, I am. And at a certain point, we have to be willing to confront the fact that to do our jobs properly, we have to weigh competing rights. So there is an individual homeowner right to privacy, but there's also a public right to free press, to an understanding of a major public event. And sometimes we have to decide whose rights matter more. So it's a balancing act. And the idea that the public's rights never ever matter more than the individual homeowner. Like, I've had conversations with fire agency officials who say that even in the worst of conditions, like Jasper or Fort Mac or something like that, that it's the government's job to ensure that not a single person learns that their home is gone from the media. And so what that means is that the government has decided that they get to choose when the homeowner learns and how the homeowner learns and under what context. And I think that's a big problem. If it was me, I'd be really upset about that. And so I think we have this tension that exists where agencies want to protect themselves. They want to rightly protect the public. And these are really traumatic disasters. Like, we're not pretending that this isn't a trauma that a community has been through. And so we have to be really sensitive, but I think we also have a duty to show people what has happened. And that's a really difficult thing to do in Canada right now.
Nancy, do you have anything that you want to add to that? I mean, you started this.
Yeah, I sure did. I mean, I think we can all agree the question isn't whether access should be unrestricted. And I think Jesse and Colleen have covered that off. But I think the real question here is whether the current model in Canada is overly restrictive relative to the public interest. And I think it is. And I think it's getting worse. And, Jesse and I have spent a lot of time talking about how to change that. But it's what makes it really frustrating is that it's not just like a marginal issue. Wildfire is a central recurring national story. And the people trying to document it are kept far enough away sometimes to miss the story that matters. And yeah, it's such a frustrating part of the job. It's really hard to change the minds of the people in power.
We're going to move to audience questions in a moment, but I just wonder if I could get your own challenges, assuming they are there, with your own mental health around covering these disasters and and they are traumatic events for the people experiencing them, and you may suffer from it as well. So, Colleen, can I start with you, because you cover a lot of disasters? How do you help yourself or protect yourself in these circumstances?
I had been covering disasters for a number of years before the Los Angeles wildfires last year, which occurred where I live. And I'd gotten this question a lot and felt like I was very secure in being able to say I have support systems and I do things that are good for my mental health. I get outside, I go off screens. And then covering a fire that was so close to home and that impacted people I know and love and required me at a time to evacuate as well, it really changed that answer for me, because I did not protect my mental health at all. I worked nonstop. I was so in it. And yeah, so at this point, I think what I try to say is, I think it's important to let this be an evolving conversation with yourself and to keep checking in and see what is working and what isn't. To have people in your life who are willing to have those hard conversations with you. And I think as a journalist, also something that a colleague said that was really helpful for me is, we've all been talking about the fact that these aren't a single event based story. You're not just covering a fire, you are covering a change in our world, that involves all of these systems, that is a year round and global issue. So when I was in that mode of like, I can't stop working, everything is happening, I certainly lost sight of the fact that these are stories that are important to be able to tell for the long term. So even just having that perspective of, I need to take a step back now because I need to be able to be here to do this reporting 6 months from now or a year from now and be able to really show up, when other cameras have left or and other reporters have left. That was helpful for me as a journalist. And I will just say my strategy as like a human, I just started scheduling things for myself that had cancellation fees. And that's how I stopped reporting all the time, is I financially constrained myself with workout classes and events that I could not say no to make myself stop working. I don't think that is the best thing to say. But it is what worked for me. And then of course I've also gone to therapy and made sure I had that level of support as well.
Okay. And can I ask anyone else if they have anything to say about that before we go to people who are watching to their questions? No. Okay. Let's try one then. Let's see. What is a story or an image you chose not to publish from a fire, and what made you pull back? Now, these are to everyone, so I'm going to see if anyone wants to put their hand up for this. Jesse?
I have a handful of images from the public memorial for Devin Gale, who was a 19-year-old firefighter who was killed in the 2023 fire season. I thought it was incredibly brave of her family to invite the media and to have a large public memorial. The impact of her death, I think, is still reverberating within the fire service. And at that event, I ended up with a series of images after the event was over of her crewmates and other firefighters gathering outside. And some of those images, seeing the impact on their faces, it felt too intrusive. I think they were strong images. I didn't know all of them, and so I didn't have an opportunity to get their consent in every case. And so I just said, you know what, like I covered the event. There were pictures of it. Her siblings spoke. They were incredibly eloquent and heartfelt. And so we used those, but the other images that felt more private in that moment, I held back on. And I think I made the right call there, because it was a challenge of trying to show what the loss of Devin meant, while also, as you said, respecting the privacy of people who are grieving a trauma.
Anyone else? Stories or images that you've held back or thought about holding back even because you weren't sure if it was the right thing to do? No? Okay. That was from Lauren. And I just want to, Lauren asked another question that Michelle, I think you might want to address. And that is Indigenous fire stewardship is having a moment in the discourse. I saw an announcement yesterday of a cultural fire burn in Squamish. And I'm not sure I've seen many of those before, just announcing to the public that was happening. But is this moment actually changing how newsrooms commission and frame wildfire stories, or is it still a sidebar to the evacuation narrative?
I mean, that's a tricky question to answer because I think each newsroom has different priorities, and I think nothing will ever get the concentrated resources of an unfolding disaster. But I do think it is a something that is having a moment, as you say, like there is more attention on it, and I think both because the support for Indigenous nations to do fire stewardship has changed in recent years. There's an understanding that fire suppression practices have led to, as Jesse was saying earlier, this accumulation of fuels that has made wildfires worse, and there needs to be more proactive burning to help to mitigate that risk, and the people best positioned to do it are in these landscapes who are stewarding their territories. So it's kind of an aligned priority as a wildfire strategy. But I think in terms of newsrooms like the Narwhal, where we do focus on solutions journalism, it does offer an opportunity, I think, to report on wildfire in a way that I think can help shift how people think about it. Like Jesse was saying earlier, not all fire is bad fire. It's not helpful to have people be terrified of fire all the time because it does naturally occur. It's, in many instances beneficial for landscapes. So I think that it is starting to shift. It gives us a different way, I think, to frame wildfire, to talk about it, to educate people, and to kind of draw those connections between, historic fire management practices, the changing climate, and what communities can be doing that's more proactive. And I think it also gives us a way to talk about the resources that we're investing into wildfire response and wildfire prevention. Water bombers are extremely expensive. They cost millions and millions of dollars, but you can be training people in community to be working on the land proactively, to be stewarding it and monitoring it. And I just mentioned that because we haven't really talked about the economic impacts of wildfire, but in Canada, they're enormous. And they do have an impact on people's lives, on our ability to rebuild, on what else we can fund in society, because we're constantly dealing with the cost of disasters. And so another thing we report on with these cultural burns and with Indigenous fire management programs is that they create jobs for people, and they're a pretty cost-effective way to mitigate wildfires. So that took a little detour, but yes, I think it's changing.
Okay. Detours are welcome here. Colleen, does this conversation happen in the United States as much as it happens here about trying to bring that First Nations Indigenous perspective into care and tending of the forest as a meaningful way to manage it in order to prevent devastating wildfire?
This has also been an increasingly common conversation in the US as well in recent years. Of course, this is a practice going back time immemorial, and in the US was outlawed for decades, despite the research and evidence that it was having that beneficial impact on the land, let alone the other impacts of taking away this practice. But in recent years, there has been a push to have more collaboration between Indigenous communities and the various fire organizations that do burning. I think in the US, there's always a challenge of the different bodies that own the land that is being burned. So there's always a conversation of how to collaborate because of these borders that we have of what is state land, what is Indigenous land, what is federal land, and then the different practices, regulations, and bodies who are permitted to do these practices. So it's definitely a larger conversation in recent years, but I would say it's very much still evolving and is more present in some areas than others, but is also something that I think the media here is trying to pay attention to. But certainly there could be a lot more reporting on cultural burning and general practices of good fire in the US.
Okay. I want to turn now to another question from Stuart, and we don't think we've really talked about this much yet. What can be done to improve coverage of the experiences and perspectives of frontline firefighters? Jesse, I kind of feel like that's for you, at least initially.
Yes, and I will try to keep it brief. The biggest one is access, because government agencies, at least in Canada, make it very, very, very difficult for their staff, firefighters, to talk freely to the media. And the vast majority of my reporting, and a lot of what went into my book actually, is perspectives and interviews and stories from frontline firefighters that I didn't gather them on the front line. What being on the front line gave me the ability to do was to learn about how fire works, be able to speak their language a little bit, and to some degree demonstrate to firefighters that I have an interest in this and that I am somebody they might be willing to talk to, even though their bosses don't want them to. And so I think that changing the frontline access thing, I think, is important. I also think what it will hopefully do is help the agencies themselves recognize that they don't need to be so restrictive with their own staff. They can trust their firefighters to talk to us. They don't need to have to try to control the narrative so much. Like, they're afraid of a thing that I think is largely not as big a risk as they think it is. And so if we can do better wildfire coverage broadly, which means being on the front line more, I think it will become easier for firefighters themselves to talk to us, for them to be able to do so without feeling like they're risking their jobs. And they will see themselves reflected in the coverage more. And so then it would just build a familiarity with wildfire journalism that I think doesn't really exist in Canada right now.
Yeah, I mean, we did a story maybe year and a half ago now, with a fire in Alberta, wildland firefighter or wildfire land fighter who didn't want to identify himself, and one who was retired because there were only two who could speak frankly. And the story was about how Alberta was having so much trouble retaining firefighters because of the shockingly poor pay, and what that was doing to the ability to actually fight fire in the first place. And then there's the health issue on top of that. It was really quite surprising. So obviously I agree with you, Jesse, to let these people speak their experience is important. And then there's also that amazing reporting from, am I right, the New York Times, about the devastating impacts on firefighters' health as well, that I don't think people really understood. So I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to say on that topic.
I would just add that it's a fragile system. We rely so heavily in Canada on seasonal, precarious labor. The seasons are getting longer. It means burnout. The wildfire services have trouble retaining these people during the off season. We're starting to rely more on international crews. So the system is working, but at some point it isn't going to work. And I think we need to try to get at that story. But it's really hard when we can't have those kind of frank conversations with the people doing the firefighting.
Colleen, have you had access to speak to firefighters about their work? What is or isn't good or bad? Yeah.
I think similar to what Jesse was describing, I mean, there's firefighter staff are often not authorized to speak to the media. I think a significant shift we've seen here is that there's been unions that have sprung up and that have really coordinated to have someone who is an experienced firefighter, often retired, or working contract, who can speak to some of these issues and also help connect reporters with firefighters, so that that has been a way, like I've done reporting on even the conditions that firefighters live in. And in the US, they similarly are paid very poorly, often sent to areas that have very expensive housing, and then they have nowhere they can sleep while fighting these fires, while working these weeks and horrible hours. So of course, all of that in addition to the really serious concerns about health, pay, and just what this means for a person to live in this way. Yeah, so I would say that has been something that's helpful on the US side, but of course that's something where that was kind of like a grassroots movement that started within firefighting forces, certainly not affiliated with the agencies.
Yeah, no unions here, or no, there are unions, I think, for some of the firefighters, but they're not, I don't know that how effective they actually are. Colleen, I just want to stay with you. We've just got a few minutes left here. Time flies. This was directed specifically for you, Colleen, from Lacey. Research has shown that the LA wildfires disproportionately affect Latino and other underserved communities. At the same time, reporting has highlighted how Black communities like Altadena are shaped by longer histories of displacement. How can we make sure these voices are centered amidst all the reporting on more visible or affluent areas?
Yeah, this has definitely been something that has been a challenge here in Los Angeles, to really make sure that we are reflecting the communities that were impacted and that also need this ongoing reporting and attention. I know in addition to those stats, when we're seeing the early reports of people who are still displaced, that is also disproportionately people of color who are not making it back into these communities. So I think part of the way to do that is to make sure that when we're looking at these breaking news stories, we are grounding them in history and context, that we are looking at a community like Altadena and saying, this is a historically Black neighborhood. This is an area that was experiencing gentrification before the fires happened. You know, this is an area where people were already being pushed out due to prices. So I think that's all context that's relevant to the conversation here, because any challenges that existed before a wildfire are certainly going to be exacerbated in the aftermath of it, especially when it comes to affordability. So I think having that history and context in there, and then also just as journalists, when we're going to communities, making sure that we are taking that extra step to really understand the places that we are going to, and trying to be representative of the communities that are there. And I think I'm trying to speak quickly, I know we're coming to the end, really taking that extra step to do the work and meet people and connect. And not everyone's going to end up being a source, but having those community connections and proving that you're willing to meet people and meet them where they are is important, just to actually get that representative work done.
I think we're going to have to that we talk about, but for now, I just wanted to say thank you to Colleen and Jesse, Michelle, and Nancy for a great conversation, and thank you to the CJF for making this happen. Goodbye.